Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the WFSB Attorney General Debate. I am your moderator today, Dennis House, and I'm joined by this panelist here. He is the Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law, Timothy Fisher. We thank you for being with us here, Dean Fisher. And let's meet the candidates now. They are, for the Republicans, Sue Hatfield, and the Democrats, William Tong. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, Dennis.
Here are the rules. You'll be asked a question. You'll have 1 minute to answer. Each candidate will get 1 minute, and then the person who gets the question first will then have 30 seconds to rebut. We had a coin toss before this all began, and Sue Hatfield won, so she got to choose her seat and whether she goes first, and she chose to do so. So here's the first question for you. Give us a sense of what kind of Attorney General you will be and what kind of impact you'll have on the people of Connecticut and how you'll change their lives.
I will first and foremost focus on Connecticut and the issues here, right here at home. I will be much like Attorney General Jepsen in that he came from a political background, and he put that background aside when he assumed the office of Attorney General. And that's exactly the type of Attorney General I will be for the state of Connecticut. I will let the law be my guide, and I will always focus on Connecticut. I will work in a bipartisan fashion with anybody that assumes the position of governor and whoever's in office down in the administration in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Tong, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, the Attorney General's first job and most important job is to protect and defend the people of this state. And I think a lot of families here in Connecticut feel like Donald Trump has put a target on their backs and is leading an unprecedented attack against our way of life here in Connecticut. Now, for 12 years, I've served in the legislature and taken on the NRA, wrote some of the strongest gun laws in the nation, took on the big banks to help thousands of Connecticut families stay in their homes, wrote tough new laws to prevent child abuse. And George Jepsen is indeed leading the nation. He's filed more than 40 actions against the Trump administration to stand up to Donald Trump and his unprecedented assault on the people of this state. Now, my opponent was asked if she supports the president's policy, the most morally indefensible policy of separating children from their families at the border, and she said, yes, she does. And that's a clear and stark difference between the two of us. I would stand with Donald Trump every time and protect the people of this state.
Ms. Hatfield, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. I first and foremost do not support separation of children, and I will focus on Connecticut as Connecticut's next AG. I'm not sure if William Tong is running for president or running for the Attorney General position for Connecticut, but there are going to be times where we need to work with the administration in a bipartisan fashion. For one, the opioid crisis. Over 1,000 of our residents died last year due to overdose. The other is Eastern Connecticut's crumbling foundation issue. We need to be able to work in a bipartisan fashion. And the third issue is privacy. That's also something.
Dean Fisher? Our next question goes to Mr. Tong.
Certainly. So looking back at the people who have served as our Attorney General over the decades, what are some of the attributes that you most hope to demonstrate yourself if you become Attorney General?
So both Attorney General Jepsen and Attorney General Blumenthal understood the whole job of being Attorney General. They understood, first of all, the Attorney General has only civil jurisdiction in the state over civil matters, and they deal with major civil litigation of the type that I've done for almost 20 years in private practice, cases against Volkswagen and the big tobacco companies, cases against the major rating agencies. But they also led a major state agency of more than 200 lawyers, investigators, and staff, and they went beyond the courtroom job. And as I've said over and over again in the primary and now in the general election, it's not just the Attorney General's job to practice the law, but also to change it. So when George Jepsen wanted to expand the Attorney General's powers to go after the big pharmaceutical companies in the opioid crisis and in price fixing, he came to the legislature and said to me as chairman of the Judiciary Committee to change the law. Dick Blumenthal did the same thing with price gouging and gasoline. That's a key component of what the Attorney General does.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. I will be much like Attorney General Jepsen in working in a bipartisan fashion. Now, Attorney Tong brings up the issue of litigation, and that's something that I do have experience with. Attorney Tong has never brought a trial to verdict in state court. And if you look at the last annual report, there was over 22,000 pending trial court cases. So the next Attorney General needs to be able to bring a case to verdict before judge or jury. Also, there's more than 600 public interest investigations in the Attorney General's office, and that's something that I have the experience leading investigations that affect our public and the citizens in Connecticut.
Thank you, Ms. Hatfield. You have 30 seconds to rebut, Mr.
Yeah,
Tong.
look, that's just not true. And the Hartford Courant yesterday said that Ms. Hatfield's ads that she's running now on television are demonstrably false and untrue, and facts matter. The fact is I have much more experience, frankly, than my predecessors in civil litigation. As far as I can tell, Ms. Hatfield doesn't have any experience in civil litigation. That's all the Attorney General does. And she said earlier that she does not support the policy of separating children from their families. The video shows that she does.
Thank you. Our next question goes to Ms. Hatfield. Under General Jepsen, the state settled the Seaback versus Rowland class action litigation. As a result of that settlement, millions of dollars have been paid to former state employees. Settlements to all plaintiffs, though, have not yet been completed. As AG, would you strive to resolve this long-running problem, and what would you do?
Right, so I come from this in an interesting perspective. I'm the only statewide candidate that's also a state employee. I'm a member of a union. My husband's a retired state trooper. He's also was a member of the union as well. So I am most and best equipped to work on this issue with the unions, with the Seaback issue, and I bring a unique understanding and perspective of how to move forward and make sure that this settlement and issue is brought to completion.
Mr. Tong, 1 minute.
So I've actually worked on this issue. This settlement came before the Judiciary Committee, of which I am chairman, to ensure that the legislature did approve the settlement. It was opposed, that settlement was opposed largely on partisan grounds by my Republican colleagues in the legislature. And the fact is it came about because of the Republican Party's attack on working people here in this state and Governor Rowland's attack on working people here in this state. And we have to move away from that. We have this settlement and this major liability because Governor Rowland stepped forward and said that he wanted to attack working people in unions. And that's what Ms. Hatfield's running mate Bob Stefanowski wants to do. He wants to take $11 billion out of the state budget. And I think in order to accomplish that, he has to go after working people and break contracts with working people, including state employees like Ms. Hatfield and her husband.
Ms. Hatfield, you have 30 seconds to
Thank
rebut.
you. I am a working person. My husband's also a working person. And we're members. I am a member of a union. My husband's a member of the union. And as Attorney General, I first and foremost will follow the law. And when there's a contract that is duly executed, those need to be honored. So I will be a fair and impartial Attorney General and will work in a bipartisan way regardless of who is Republican or who is Democrat and which issue it's falling. I'll do what's best and right for the people of Connecticut.
Thank you. Our next question from Dean Fisher to Mr. Tong.
Representative Tong, there's much discussion about making Connecticut more business friendly.
Yeah.
Are there any enforcement actions that the Office of Attorney General has undertaken that you would not have pursued?
Currently by the Office of the Attorney General today.
Or that you remember over time?
You know, I think one of the mistakes of previous administrations was to commence investigations and not to close them. And I think it's extraordinarily important for the Attorney General to root out misconduct and wrongdoing and to go after businesses that cheat Connecticut residents. But you've got to go into those with an eye towards conducting an investigation, and if you don't find anything, to step away from it and exonerate. But I think what we do have to do here in Connecticut is increase our staffing and focus on consumer protection, much like Richard Blumenthal did. Predatory lending, there's a lot of discussion now in the governor's race about payday lending. Predatory lending, particularly among student loan lenders, is a very serious problem. We have issues around predatory lending with respect to seniors. Drug prices are much higher than they need to be, sometimes as high as 1,000% more. So I think the Attorney General needs to step forward and protect consumers here in Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. And during this campaign, I've been traveling extensively, meeting with small businesses, and the thing that they are most concerned about is going back to the Blumenthal era, where questions weren't asked, communication wasn't back and forth. They received summons that they were being sued. So companies are very fearful of going back to that model, and I've been working very hard to extend my hand, and I will continue to do so as the next Attorney General, to work in a collaborative approach with different businesses, and those that do break the law, I will vigorously enforce the law. That's the type of Attorney General that I will be.
Mr. Tong, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, so part of my job, in addition to being chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is I'm chairman of the Commission on Economic Competitiveness. And part of my job is to chart a new path for growth here in Connecticut, focused on bioscience, advanced manufacturing, media and technology here in Connecticut. I'll continue in that role, although in a different role as Attorney General. I think my job will be to focus on alleviating the squeeze and the financial pressure that people feel from big companies preying on consumers here in Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. As you know, 2 years ago, the Assistant Attorneys General voted to unionize. They're still working without a contract, and they are currently in binding arbitration seeking higher wages. What is your position on their contract? Ms. Hatfield, you have 1 minute.
So I will enforce the laws, and I will be a fair and impartial guide when interpreting the law. As a member of a union myself, I know the benefits and the pitfalls of working within a union. And as the next Attorney General, I will work in a collaborative approach with the different parties and their interests and move forward.
But in terms of this case, what would you do?
With respect to,
well, you know, while they're in binding arbitration, they're seeking higher wages. What is your position on that? Should they be getting the higher wages? Or?
Without speaking directly to that, I think that's something that I would talk further with them after having a chance to review their wages and after reviewing all of the documents.
Mr. Tong, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I certainly honor the right of the Assistant Attorney Generals to organize and look forward to negotiating with them and working with them. I should know that they're organized by AFT, the American Federation of Teachers in Connecticut, and that they have endorsed me. And the reason why the Assistant Attorneys General have endorsed me is because they know that I understand what the office does, that I understand that they know best how to do their jobs in a lot of the core functions of the office, from child support enforcement to child protection with DCF to claims against the state. They also know that I know the difference between the Attorney General's office and the Chief State's Attorney's office. The Chief State's Attorney's office has exclusive, nearly exclusive jurisdiction over criminal matters. Now, Ms. Hatfield in her ads is claiming that she will take on criminals and drug lords and meth dealers. That's just not what the Attorney General does. That's the Chief State's Attorney. The Attorney General has exclusively civil jurisdiction, and her ads have been labeled as misleading by many newspapers.
Thank you,
here
Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Thank you. I think what's misleading is Attorney Tong saying he's qualified for this position under the Bicewitz standard, where he's clearly not. He's never tried a case to verdict in state court before judge and jury. The annual report of the Attorney General's office, there's 22,000 pending trial cases. I believe that the next Attorney General should have at least tried one case to verdict before judge and jury.
Thank you. Ms. Hatfield. Dean Fisher.
May I respond to that?
No.
Okay.
Another budget question. The budget of the Attorney General's office is over $30 million.
Yeah.
If Governor Lamont or Governor Stefanowski asked you to cut that budget, where would you trim?
Well, it's very difficult right now because I don't think we have enough personnel on the ground, particularly in the consumer protection area. You know, when Dick Blumenthal was Attorney General, we had something like as many as 235 Assistant Attorneys General. It got down to 215 under George Jepsen, maybe closer to 200 right now. So we're really working on a shoestring budget, and the fact is the Attorney General's office returns much more to the state in terms of proceeds from settlements. It more than pays for itself, and it just doesn't make sense for the state to have the Attorney General and our team of lawyers, investigators, and staff to have our arms tied behind our backs. So I would make a fervent appeal that they not cut our budget, and I think that's what differentiates me from my opponent. I have the relationships, the experience in the legislature as a chairman of 2 major committees to make sure that the budget is not impacted in the Attorney General's office.
Thank you. Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. I have some concerns about Attorney Tong and his constant battling of the administration. If we're on a shoestring, we need to focus on Connecticut's issues as opposed to leading a charge against the administration and bringing more lawsuits just because it's political and not politics. And also, he wants to develop a civil rights union. He wants to grow this department. When people out there are struggling, and I'm hearing daily, they don't have enough resources in the Attorney General's office. I will focus on what is right and fair for the people of Connecticut. I will let not politics be my guide, but the law will be.
Mr. Tong, you have 30 seconds.
Attorney General Jepsen has taken on the Trump administration more than 40 times because he understands that the people of this state are under attack and that this is entirely about Connecticut. The fight in Texas federal court over the Affordable Care Act is entirely about Connecticut and the thousands of Connecticut families that depend on the Affordable Care Act. The fight over downwind air pollution, over clean water, is entirely about Connecticut. The fight for a civil rights division is about immigrants here in Connecticut, and I can only presume that my opponent would not help immigrants and immigrant communities here in Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Our next question. Sheff versus O'Neill and a related federal case are on a path for the Connecticut Supreme Court. As Attorney General, what positions will you take in this important case that could affect tens of thousands of Connecticut students? Ms. Hatfield.
Well, I always put the students first. And in looking at the direction of how this litigation proceeds, I would need to review the underlying documents and the pleadings before giving an approach publicly of where my position will be. But first and foremost, the students of Connecticut, we need to focus on our students, and really our resources need to be allocated better to our education system, our students here in Connecticut, and that will always be my focus, is on the next generation and making sure that they receive adequate education, that the educational system is properly funded.
Mr. Tong.
So this is a critical issue for the state, and you've really got to be steeped, not just in the Sheff case, but in the CJEF battle around equity and education funding, and also the 1F consent decree, which covers the Department of Children and Families. And you have to be facile with these issues because you have to provide day-to-day advice to the state and advise the state how to comply with Sheff versus O'Neill. What I would do is sit down with every department and also municipalities across the state and their boards of education to find a way to meet the goals, the integration and racial equity goals of the Sheff versus O'Neill case, and also take it a step further because I think that equity in education funding really matters to Sheff versus O'Neill. And to ensure that we provide a more than adequate level of education for kids in our state, including kids in our cities, we have to have an education funding formula that works. And I would sit down with my colleagues in the legislature, leverage that experience as a legislator, and pull people together and get a formula that works.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 30 seconds to rebut.
Yes, and like I will review the pleadings, and I will do what's in the best interest for the people of Connecticut. While I was out on the campaign trail, I was in Bridgeport and at an event, and I heard a story that a teacher in Bridgeport had to do a GoFundMe page for school supplies. I say enough is enough. We need to focus on what's in the best interest of Connecticut for the children and for their educational future.
Thank you. Dean Fisher.
Like many states, Connecticut is facing an opioid addiction crisis. And there is a debate about whether to view it as a criminal justice question or a public health question. How do you view that dichotomy?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's a public health question in terms of treatment and prevention. And there's two ways in which Connecticut is leading the way in the Attorney General's office. Attorney General Jepsen is the national leader of the opioid investigation, and I think he's taken the right approach by focusing on the big pharmaceutical companies, but also extending his investigation to the entire addiction industry, including distributors and pharmacy benefit managers, healthcare providers, treatment centers, people that make money off of other people's misery. Also, the generic drug manufacturer's price fixing case is important to the opioid crisis because if people don't get the treatment that they need, they go seeking for illicit drugs to self-medicate. So beyond that, there's a mix of initiatives from increasing the availability of Narcan, for example, and medically assisted treatment, to penalizing dealing in fentanyl, which is a mix of public health and criminal justice measures.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield.
Thank you. I've seen this issue from both the healthcare perspective as well as the criminal justice perspective. I've worked as a registered nurse for nearly 10 years at Yale New Haven Hospital in mental health, where I worked day to day with people that are struggling with addiction and with opioid issues. As a prosecutor, I've seen those same people come through the courthouse doors that have committed crimes due to their addiction. One area that I think we need initial help with is educating line prosecutors about addiction, looking for signs and symptoms of that, as well as reaching out to our first responders and educating them to really identifying, and it'll be going into the treatment perspective as well.
Mr. Tong, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, and so again, this is a great example of how differently we see the job of Attorney General. It's both the major civil litigation job, in which I have years and years of experience, but also the legislative side of the job, not just practicing the law, but changing it and going to the legislature and saying, you must limit the amount of time, for example, that people have prescriptions for opioids. You must increase the availability of Narcan. You must increase penalties for dealing fentanyl. It won't be my job to deal with line prosecutors because they work for another department, the Chief State's Attorney.
Thank you. Our next question from Ms. Hatfield. The amount of state debt is a looming issue in this year's gubernatorial race, as you know, and as Attorney General, you will have a seat on the Bond Commission. In light of the recent round of bonding, which was fairly controversial, how do you expect to vote on issues before the Bond Commission?
I will bring a fiscally conservative voice to that Bond Commission. I worked as a public finance lawyer on major cases. One was a near $1 billion nuclear power plant sale. So I'm able to review the documents, root out waste and fraud. So I will bring a conservative vote to that Bond Commission. I was at the last Bond Commission, and there was so much waste in that package. Pork projects that I spoke up against, splash pads, grocery stores. My opponent stood silent. If you heard, there was 300 bridges that are structurally deficient here in Connecticut, 3 of the bridges that are over bodies of water. That's where my outrage is. There was no funding for structural fixes to bridges and items that could create a public safety hazard. I stand where I will be a fiscally conservative voice, and I'm just appalled that my opponent didn't speak out, and I do have grave concerns.
Thank you, Ms. Hatfield. Mr. Tong, you have 1 minute.
Look, I'll closely scrutinize any request for bonding, but as far as I can tell, Ms. Hatfield's attendance at the Bond Commission meeting was her first attendance ever at a Bond Commission meeting, and I don't think it does any good to demagogue this issue or to make it a political football in this race. I talked about this in the previous debate. It's okay to sit back and criticize splash pads if you've never been to New Haven and you don't know why it's important to have splash pads in New Haven. It's important to have splash pads in New Haven because that's where kids can go during the summertime so they don't get into trouble because there's no community pool. By the way, it's also where they get their lunch. And so that's why we need splash pads in Connecticut. There's a long list of bonding from that last Bond Commission agenda that helps courthouses, that does physical plant improvements for criminal courthouses in which Ms. Hatfield practices, schools in New London, the harbor, dredging in New London, critical investments for Eastern Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Ms. Hatfield, you have 30 seconds to rebut.
Thank you. Families traveling over those bridges where their children are strapped in the back seat of cars, that's a priority of making sure that our bridges are safe for our families here in Connecticut. In an ideal world, every child should have access to a splash pad. But for now, when we are struggling with our debt load, we need to focus on things that matter, such as our public safety and making sure that all of our citizens are safe.
Very good. Our next question from Dean Fisher.
In 20 of the last 28 years, the Attorney General and the Governor have been from different political parties.
Yeah.
If that's the case for you as Attorney General and the state agency heads are appointed from the other political party, who will choose litigation strategies and priorities, you or them?
So technically, it depends on the statute and it depends on the action. On antitrust matters, the Attorney General has pretty much plenary authority. Under the Connecticut Unfair Insurance Practices Act, for example, COWIPA, that statute, you need the consent of the Commissioner of Insurance. For the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act, you need the consent of the Commissioner of Consumer Protection. And in many ways, the governor and the Attorney General have to work together. Now, that worked under Dick Blumenthal and John Rowland and Joni Rell. And I think Ned Lamont's going to be our next governor, but if Bob Stefanowski is, the very first day I'll walk over to his office, stick up my hand, hopefully shake his hand, and look forward to working together with him on the priorities affecting the people of this state. But let me say this, if he means to come in and cut $11 billion from the state budget tomorrow and slice it in half and decimate schools and bridges and roads and public safety, I will stop him right there.
Thank you. Ms. Hatfield, you have 1 minute.
I will work with either Bob Stefanowski or Ned Lamont, and I will always include them in my decisions as Attorney General and gain their input. It doesn't mean that I will necessarily follow each and every decision or input that they give to me, but I will make sure that they are part of the conversation with that.
Very good. Mr. Tong, you get 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, so I was just going to say that if Governor Stefanowski means to come in and decimate public education, you know, the role of the Attorney General is then to speak up and say that this doesn't work for the people of Connecticut. And this is what I think it means to do the whole job of being Attorney General, not just the litigation job, but the policy job, and to fight and protect and defend the people of this state.
Okay, we now move on to our rapid fire segment, and Dean Fisher has the first question and a follow-up, and we'll begin with Ms. Hatfield.
Would you defend Connecticut's law granting in-state tuition to students who are undocumented if that were challenged on a constitutional basis by the federal government?
I will always follow Connecticut laws and enforce them, so yes.
Yes.
And would that be your decision or the governor's?
That would be my decision. My decision would be, though, to follow the law and enforce the laws of Connecticut.
The Attorney General issues opinion letters under certain circumstances. Can you name any opinions issued by the past two Attorneys General that you would have not issued, Mr. Tong?
We only have one Attorney General at a time, and it's not my role to second-guess prior Attorneys General and this sitting Attorney General.
Ms. Hatfield.
I would answer that I will defend Attorney General Jepsen's decisions on most of his opinions.
Mr. Fisher.
Is it a good thing for the state of Connecticut that the attorneys in the Office of the Attorney General have unionized?
I am a member of a union, so it's in existence now, yes.
Mr. Tong.
Yes.
Are there units in the Office of the Attorney General that you believe should be either created or expanded? Mr. Tong.
Yes, the Civil Rights Division and the Consumer Protection Division should be expanded.
Ms. Hatfield.
I believe that with regard to employment discrimination, I did sue the state of Connecticut, and it took over 2 years to settle that. That's where the focus needs to be, on education for our state employees. So that is one area, the employment discrimination.
And a follow-up, do you think that any unit should be eliminated? Are there any?
Right, without looking through, and that's something that I will decide after the first week of being in office.
Mr. Tong.
There are 15 departments. They all work extraordinarily hard. I can't think of one that I would cut.
Mr. Fisher.
President Trump has said that he believes we should roll back emission standards for cars, which would then conflict with Connecticut standards. Attorney General Jepsen has said he will resist that plan by the president. Do you agree with the president or with Attorney General Jepsen on that question?
If looking at Connecticut standards, I would enforce Connecticut law and its standards, so I would agree with Attorney General Jepsen.
Mr. Tong.
Yes, I'd stand with George.
That concludes our debate. We thank the candidates for being with us here. Sue Hatfield, the Republican, William Tong, the Democrat, and our panelist, the Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law, Tim Fisher. And thank you for watching at home. We'll see you Sunday on Face the State.
Thank you. That was quick.